Okay, welcome to the second keynote lecture of the 6th Dobson Development Conference. I'm Kunal Sen, I'm chairing this lecture. Really privileged to introduce the keynote lecturer today, Ragui Assaad. Ragui is a professor of planning and public affairs in the Humphrey School of Public Affairs in the University of Minnesota in the US. Ragui researches education, labor policy, labor markets in developing countries with a focus on the Middle East and North Africa. And I should say that for any of us who has tried to understand MENA labor markets, we always go to Ragui's work. And Ragui provides us the lens to understand labor markets in the MENA region. Ragui has worked on inequality opportunity in education, labor markets, transitions from school to work, employment and unemployment dynamics, family formation, informality, labor market, responses to economic shocks, international migration, including the effects of forced migration, a really wide, disparate, and very rich body of work. Ragui is also a research fellow at the Economic Research Forum in Cairo, in Egypt, and serves on its board of trustees. He's also a research fellow of the Institute for the Study of Labor, IZA, in Bonn. He served as the regional director for the West Asia and North Africa for the Population Council based in Cairo from 2005 to 2008. And can't really have somebody better than Ragui to speak to us on how do labor markets in Middle East, North Africa function. Ragui, over to you. Ragui could speak for 40 minutes, and then we're going to have 20 minutes, hopefully, for question and answer. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kunal, for this lovely introduction. And thank you all for sticking it out till the very last moment in this conference. And I appreciate seeing all of you here. So while my presentation is titled Making Sense of Labor Markets in North Africa, I'm actually going to talk more about MENA, Middle East, North Africa. I'll bring in a few more examples outside North Africa. This is kind of the result of years of work on this topic. This is a region that is generally not discussed very often in development conferences. Usually we talk about security and geopolitics and failed states and things like that, but rarely do we talk about a development sort of topic about the region. And I'm glad that we're able to include it in the discussion. So let's first go over some stylized facts that most of us know about North African and Middle East labor markets. First, we have very high unemployment rates, especially among educated youth, and disproportionately among women in this region more than other regions. And these are symptoms of a very protracted and increasingly so school-to-work transition for young new entrants. Almost, as I'll show you, most of the unemployment is concentrated among new entrants, and some of these transitions take up to 5-6 years before people enter into some kind of employment. In fact, there is a term that has been coined to describe these very extended school-to-work transitions and transitions to adulthood in general, which is called waithood or wait adulthood, which has actually been a term that was coined to study the Middle East because of the length of the transition that youth undergo. Now, there's also something we talked about a lot, low and stagnant female labor force participation. If you remember Federica's U-shaped curve, then these bunch of countries that are well below the trend, and they were mostly middle-income countries, and those are pretty much mostly Middle East and North African countries. But it's also stagnant, and that's probably the more surprising result, as I will talk about later. This is sometimes known as the MENA paradox, because education attainment has risen very rapidly among women in MENA. And there has been historically a strong relationship between education and labor force participation, but that relationship is weakening over time. Now, there's also a very oversized employment in the public sector. We saw that a little bit in Frederica's slides, showing it's not just the state-owned enterprises, but the state itself. The bureaucracy is often very large, together with a very small, anemic, formal private sector and rising informality. And so we are seeing that while formal sector jobs are a good chunk of the labor force, it's mostly in the public sector. Now, there are also, as I mentioned, large increases in educational attainment. So big and among the most rapid increases in the world. However, a lot of this is oriented towards the acquisition of credentials rather than skills. And so that distortion in the way education attainment is something that I'd like to refer to as well. Now, so let's just look at these numbers from ILO model estimates. I have Arab states as one category and Northern Africa as another, because that's the way that the ILO classifies things. And you can see that clearly in terms of female labor force participation, they are the two lowest in the world, followed closely by South Asia. But in terms of, and the youth unemployment, you have these much higher rates, especially among women. And look at the gaps between men and women are much larger in those two regions, Northern Africa and the Arab states, than they are in other regions, which tend to, in most regions, women tend to have somewhat higher unemployment rates with some exceptions. So where do we go with this? What do we make of these stylized facts, and how can we actually explain them? And this is where my argument comes, that a lot of these stylized facts, if not all of them, are explained by a sort of deep and persistent dualism in the labor market. It is a sort of formal, informal dualism, but the formal part very much dominated by public sector employment. And that public sector hiring, I argue, is driven by a political goal, political economy goal, which is the need for political appeasement in the context of what I refer to as authoritarian bargain social contract. So basically, think about the authoritarian bargain as an implicit contract between authoritarian regimes, not the whole population, but with the politically significant groups in the population that can cause problems for the regime. And in exchange for these well-compensated jobs in the bureaucracy and the public sector, often also in the security forces, you have the state demands political quiescence, if not loyalty. And now these politically significant groups vary from one context to another, but they often include the middle class, and generally it's targeted towards people with higher level, secondary or university levels of education. They are, in some context, it's the entire national population, like in the Gulf cooperation countries that have most of their labor forces are migrant workers. And so the nationals are the ones who get the public sector jobs, and the migrants then occupy the rest of employment in the economy. And then in some countries, it is targeted to politically significant sects, tribes, or clans. And you can think of in Jordan, it's the Transjordanians as opposed to the Palestinians. In Iraq, it used to be the Sunni, and now it's the Shia. And in Syria, it's the Alawites, etc. So basically, these public sector jobs are primarily a way of sharing the rent from hydrocarbon or other mineral wealth. So there is a rent sharing process going through this. And of course, it goes with other sorts of public subsidies, sometimes like consumer subsidies or energy subsidies and things like that. Now, there are clearly this bargain was hard to maintain, especially as oil prices fell in the mid-1980s. And there was fiscal crises led to the erosion of the bargain, but not its wholesale renegotiation. And so the erosion happened at the expense of new entrants, at the expense of people knocking at the door to trying to get in, while trying to protect insiders. And so the cost of adjustment shifted almost completely to these new entrants and basically youth. And you can explain a lot of the unrest that happened during the Arab Spring as a result of the youth feeling excluded, especially middle-class youth feeling excluded from that bargain. Now, the dualism that results from this arrangement, while public sector employment has been eroded as a result of the erosion of the bargain, there's still a great deal of effect in terms of the expectations that are being driven by the possibility of public sector employment that still drives labor market behavior until today. Now, the bargain also has very strong gendered outcomes. And it's partly because of there is a very strong gender norm about the male breadwinner, female homemaker, but women were treated for public sector employment equally to men, even though there is a great deal of gender discrimination and segregation in the private sector, and therefore there was a very strong preference for women in public sector employment. And so, as the bargain is eroded, women are paying the price in terms of access to employment, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So let's look at some of the evidence, and the first on unemployment. Unemployment is very strongly associated with education. So as you can see, unemployment rises with educational attainment, which is and especially among women. It's essentially evidence that the people who are unemployed, openly unemployed, are those who are looking for formal employment. And formal employment essentially means waiting for a government job, as we will see in a minute. And so the poor cannot afford to be unemployed, and they get into informal employment, into the informal economy, and try to find livelihoods that way. So, and the less educated. So let's actually look also at the proportion. Unemployment is primarily a new entrance phenomenon, as I mentioned. So this is the proportion of people seeking their first jobs in some of the MENA countries relative to some comparator countries. And so you can see that a much higher proportion generally, especially among women, are seeking their first job when in the unemployment queue. The other piece here is the correlation between unemployment and household wealth quintile. So I have here the data in 5 quintiles for each country, and you can see that unemployment, if anything, has a positive relationship with wealth, and that is the families that can afford to have their young people sit around not working are more likely to have them be unemployed, and you can see that relationship is stronger in some countries than in others, but it's present in nearly all the instances. Now, that doesn't mean that poor people don't have labor market issues, and I think that's where we discussed that the very first day. Unemployment is a poor measure of the labor market the challenges that the poor and the less educated experience. And this is another indicator which the ILO has recommended, which is time-related underemployment. And time-related underemployment, these people who are working but not working sufficient hours to basically they're working fewer than 35 hours a week for involuntary reasons. They would like to work more. And that indicator of labor underutilization is much more strongly negatively associated with wealth. And so if you want to look at the labor market challenges experienced by the poor, that's the kind of indicator you want to look at more so than the unemployment rate, and especially the youth unemployment rate. So how does that relate to one of the second features, which is the kind of the oversized public sector? So here you have the proportion of employment in the public sector in MENA vis-a-vis the comparator countries. And you can see immediately the contrast that MENA countries, except for Morocco, are way above the rates that you see for most other middle-income countries that you could think of as comparators. And those rates include, as I said, both state-owned enterprises as well as the civil service and in some cases the security forces as well. So let's look at the structure of employment in these economies. Remember, we talked about the economies that have vast majority of their people in self-employment versus others that have transition to, going back to Oriana's talk, transition to mostly wage employment. These economies mostly are in the middle of that transition, more on the wage employment side, but in the public sector, it's generally declining, and I'm sorry that the time periods are not equal across all the countries. Data limitations prevent that. But you can see that as the public sector declines, it's not the formal private employment, which is the orange, that is taking up the slack in most cases. You have a very small share of employment that is in this formal modern sector that we talked about. But there is this big group of people who are wage employed informally. And that's the gray. And that group is growing. The self-employment is going down as we expect from the structural transformation discussion that we had earlier. But the group the gray group in the middle includes actually a lot. I would say there's even, besides the heterogeneity within wage employment between formal and informal, there is heterogeneity within informal wage employment. And I like to divide them up into in establishments and outside of establishments. Now, outside of establishment is not that modern gig work type of employment we were talking about. It's basically casual labor in construction and transportation and in agriculture. And that is the group that is growing the fastest. The main exception to this trend in the region is Tunisia, in which the slack in public sector employment has been taken up by formal wage employment. But there, the employment growth rate overall has been very slow, and unemployment rates have been very high. So and you can see that transition towards informality is quite an important kind of response to the decline in hiring in the public sector. Now, so why does oversized public sector lead to higher unemployment? And this is an argument that I'm making here, and I'm going to be referring to a very well-worn model in development economics, which is the Harris-Todaro model, which we've heard about earlier in the conference, as being kind of the primary model that will help us explain this. Essentially, you have a public sector that is paying a higher than market wage, or let's say higher than market total compensation, because often it is in the form of the premium is in the form of working conditions and not necessarily in the form of wage. Although the wages are somewhat higher in the public sector, what people really value in public sector jobs is the stability and the non-wage benefits that go with them, the short hours, etc. So these higher than market compensation jobs are going to certain groups who have some eligibility criteria. So unlike the Harris-Todaro model, where it's a kind of undifferentiated labor, here it's particular groups who are targeted with these jobs. And clearly a certain threshold of education being important, but it could be other characteristics like which ethnic group you belong to, or whether you're a national or not. And that essentially encourages them to remain unemployed longer while queuing for these public sector jobs. There is this probability of being able to access a public sector job, and that incentivizes them to queue for these jobs. Now, the private formal sector is fairly small and uncompetitive. And you can argue that in many of these countries, it's engaged more in rent seeking, trying to get part of that rent from the mineral rents and the hydrocarbon rents than job creation. And there's been a lot of talk about cronyism within the private sector, the formal modern private sector. So that in the absence of employment in the formal sector, either in the public or the private, eventually there is the fallback position for men is to join the informal economy after being unemployed for a certain amount of time. Whereas for women, it's a different calculus. And that's why you see that in MENA, as opposed to Africa, women are less represented in the informal economy than men. Because with the male breadwinner, female homemaker model, they're not expected normatively to support the family financially. And therefore, if they don't find a job that is socially acceptable to them and their family and their society, they will remain out of the labor force. And so the non-participation is their primary fallback position as opposed to informal work. So further, I argue that dualism doesn't only drive where human capital goes in the economy and whether all the educated people end up in the public sector or in the informal economy, but it also shapes the incentives that produce the human capital. And this is really where the long-term problem lays in terms of the type and quality of human capital that is being acquired as a result of this incentive structure. So just a quick, very basic Harris-Todaro framework where you have the DP is the private sector labor demand, DP plus G is the private plus public sector labor demand. Normally, the equilibrium wage would be W star. The government is playing W gov instead of W star. That incentivizes people to basically move along this parabola, and basically the equilibrium wage is WE, where you have unemployment results from that, and as a result of that, you also have a crowding out of employment from the private sector. So not only is the private sector crowded out from an investment point of view, but also within the labor market to some extent. So that promise of a job at higher than market wage in the public sector drives the queuing for public sector jobs. So let's then talk about what the other distortions that oversized public sector generates. And this is a graph of basically the number of years of schooling acquired by country from 1975 to 2015, additional years of schooling based on the Barrow and Lee data set. So out of the 20 top countries in the world, 4 are from North Africa and 10 are from MENA. So very highly represented among the countries with the highest number of years of schooling added between 75 and 2015. So a great deal of increase in the quantity of education, if you like, but the quality of that education has been quite poor. So if you look at the TIMSS results, for example, from 2015, which are the most recent results, the percentage of students performing above the intermediate, or which is the blue, or above the low benchmark is much lower compared to comparator countries. So only South Africa is within kind of that same range, but you can see that a lot of comparator countries for which there are data, and I'm limited here by the countries that participated in TIMSS, have significantly higher thresholds of students. So the quality, and if you look at the science tests as opposed to mathematics, is not all that different. The quality of the human capital then is problematic, and it's primarily because of the kinds of signals that people are getting in the labor market. So if you have basically public employers are sending the strong signals, public employers demand credentials. All they care about is what your certificate is. Private employers want skills, but the signals from the public sector is swamping the signals from the private sector. And so people and higher education institutions respond to these signals by providing credentials. And that is the sometimes called the credentialist equilibrium, where people keep acquiring these credentials even though their value in the private sector is fairly small. And you saw the the data on rates of education that Federica provided, very, very low rates of return to education in some of these MENA countries and as a result of that. So what about the low and stagnant female labor force participation? Now, clearly that has something to do with more than just the authoritarian bargain and public sector employment. And yes, to an extent, but it is related to the story. So of course, we know that there are all kinds of cultural explanations why this region has particularly low female labor force participations. And I already talked about the dominant male breadwinner female homemaker norm. And that is drives a lot of reluctance of women to take on jobs that are considered kind of below what is what I would refer to as the reservation working conditions. So there are certain working conditions defined by the social norm that says below that type of working condition, women should not work, and then they don't feel the obligation to work because the husband or the male is supposed to be providing for the family, and she's supposed to focus on being a homemaker. Now, clearly that is reflected in a very high and unequal burden of unpaid care work. In fact, you see the data, and it's among the most lopsided burden of unpaid care work if you compare to other regions. I don't have the graphs here to show you the data, but the other thing about the unpaid care work burden is that it doesn't seem to vary a lot whether the woman is employed or not. So that it is the quantum of unpaid care work is almost fixed, irrespective of whether she's employed for 40 hours a week on top of it or not. And so you get a really true double burden for women who are employed. And that's why there's a very strong preference for a public sector where the hours are shorter and where the level of effort is not as high. Now, of course, there are all kinds of patriarchal norms that also place a very high value on modesty, on chastity, on virtue for women, and avoiding any threats to sexual safety, whether on the way to work in the public spaces or at work. And so there is partly an avoidance of informal work related to that, although the unpaid care work burden, which really happens, bites after marriage, is more constraining. As you will, I'll show you in a minute, that employment for women rises before marriage, but then at marriage takes a big hit, especially in the private sector. So among those two explanations, I would say that the first one is probably the more constraining one. And so both of these push for a strong preference for public sector work for women, where you can have larger workspaces, more safer workspaces, as well as ones that don't have such a high burden in terms of hours. And now there are also economic explanations for why women's participation is low. There's been a lot of writing linking high oil revenues with low female labor force participation. And it's kind of, again, this being able to afford the patriarchal model that oil revenue flow to the male patriarch who's able to afford to keep his women folk at home, so to speak. And it reinforces the male breadwinner, female homemaker model. But there's also been arguments that on a macro level, the Dutch disease effect on the economy tends to distort the economy away from tradables, which are more intensive in women's work, and towards non-tradable sectors like construction and transportation, which have very few opportunities for women. So a number of explanations. My question, though, is why is female participation so stagnant when education is rising so fast? Not so much why is it so low. We understand that it's been low historically. So that's the so-called MENA paradox. And we know that if you look at the data cross-sectionally, very strong relationship with employment rising at the secondary level in particular. It's almost flat and very low below the secondary level of education. And once you become go to the secondary level, you become eligible for some government employment, and it rises at that level. But that relationship between education and participation, if you plot it over time, is getting weaker and weaker over time. So that explains why, with very rapidly rising educational attainment, you are getting stagnant. You don't see the boost in labor force participation. Now, this is not easily explained by cultural explanations, and this is where I think the structure of opportunities and how it changed in the economies comes in, and in particular, the decline in public sector employment and the continued inhospitable environment in the private sector for women is really driving women, especially married women, to stay out of the workforce, especially married, educated women. And you can see that in these graphs very effectively. So this is data that is based on retrospective data, where you follow women from 10 years before marriage to 10 years after marriage. And you can see that I'm dividing the employment into public sector, private wage employment, and non-wage employment. And before, so look at Egypt, for example. Before marriage, you have private and public and private wage employment are rising together as women age and get into the workforce. Now, just at marriage, no effect at all on public sector employment. They continue increasing, no discontinuity whatsoever. And then there is this big discontinuity in private wage employment. It essentially collapses at the point of marriage, and does not, in the case of Egypt and Jordan, does not recover for the next 10 years. In the case of Tunisia, it recovers. It recovers after about 7 or 8 years. Whereas, and what picks up a little bit in the case of Egypt is self-employment, so non-wage employment being self-employment and unpaid family work. And that picks up a little bit after marriage, but not so in Jordan. And in Tunisia, it's more continuously increasing after marriage. So the opportunity structure for women dramatically changes after marriage. And if private sector work is so inhospitable, it really blocks all kinds of potential opportunities for educated women. So the question is, and that drives unemployment as well, because before marriage, women have strong preferences for public sector work. They're joining this queue for the public sector. Now, the point, unemployment among women drops significantly after marriage because they're no longer in the labor force. They just exit the labor force. And I already talked about the fact that their fallback position is non-participation rather than joining the informal economy. So the question, we talked a lot about active labor market policies in this conference, and kind of, do they really help youth in getting to the labor market faster? And in fact, we looked at the case of Algeria, where there's an employment program that helps youth through wage subsidies and other help to access jobs that was introduced in 2008 and 2010. But it turns out that employment program primarily targets public sector jobs. And what we found is that, in fact, it increased unemployment, not decreased it. And it increased unemployment by reducing the transition from unemployment to employment. So people remained in unemployment longer if they were exposed to this program more than the comparator group, which was less exposed to that program. Now, in the case of women, it increased participation a little bit. But it was that increase in participation was almost equally split between women joining the unemployment queue and women getting employment in the public sector. So when these ALMPs are targeting public sector employment, they actually encourage that queuing behavior rather than discourage it. So just to conclude, the long-standing practice of using public sector employment as a tool of social and political appeasement segments the labor market in durable ways. Even when the role of the public sector declines, that misallocation of human capital has long-term implications for the economy and for expectations in terms of the way it drives expectations of youth. And it drives these higher unemployment rates. Now, so the way you erode the contract as well matters, because if you protect the incumbents and the insiders, then you're shifting the cost of eroding that social contract on certain specific groups, with the consequences that we've seen in the case of the Middle East and North Africa. Now you see that increasing informalization, so it's like this stalled structural transformation where we expect economies to move more towards more of this modern sector formal employment, but in fact these economies are kind of stuck in the middle where there's increase in wage employment, but much of it is in the informal economy. And thank you very much.
Ragui, thank you for such a fascinating lecture. I mean, what I was struck by was the way you first presented the science facts of high youth unemployment in North Africa and also Middle East, also very low female labor participation, and also very low private sector employment growth. And you had a very provocative argument on why that may be the case, which I found was very compelling, actually. So we have quite a bit of time for Q&A. And so let's have 3 questions, if that's okay, Ragui, and 3. And then we can again have a round of questions. I saw Jens and then Oriana and Michael. Yeah. So let's start on this side first, and then we can go on the other side. Yeah. So Ian, Oriana, and Michael. Yeah,
so this isn't so much a question as a comment to endorse the idea that the importance of public sector employment can drive patterns of education which are driven by credentials and not skills. I want to tell you an anecdote, briefly. I washed up in Honduras in the late 1980s to teach in the National University. And when my Spanish got good enough, I remember listening to a conversation between 2 students in the corridors of the National University. I'm going to teach you 2 Spanish words so that you can understand the anecdote. One of them is cartón, which means piece of paper, and the other is chamba, which means a job which you do to get paid for in the public sector without doing any work. And I heard 2 students talking to one another, and one was saying to the other, "Hey there, it's a great day. I got my cartón, and now I can go and get a chamba." And so I think that this phenomenon isn't limited to MENA, and it's extremely pernicious in particular in Latin America as well, and merits probably more attention than we give it.
The mic from Ian, actually, that's okay.
Thank you so much. This is super interesting. So there is evidence in many settings that, especially when markets are very thin, that the youth are over-optimistic about the probability of getting a job. And it is this over-optimism that keeps them in unemployment. So I don't know if you have any evidence on that. The relationship between unemployment and education, the positive relationship, is actually seen a lot in South Asia. So we're doing work in Pakistan where women keep on studying, but we're talking here about graduate studies like masters and PhDs, and then they don't go to work. And in that setting, I don't think it's because you need a PhD to work for the government. I think it's because it's the only socially acceptable thing to do, to go to school. So in order not to stay at home, getting bored, you get this. But there is no estimate of the cost of offering this education because most of it is state provided. So we have a lot of investment from the state in these people who then do not use those skills to.
Thanks, Michael, need to get the mic.
I was listening to you. I was thinking what makes really MENA countries different than other countries, because in so many countries we have overgrown civil service and we have poorly managed civil service operating a la, how was it, chamber. So that is not new, and there are many things which are similar, but there is one which sticks out to me. You pointed to others, but one sticks out to me as really being a crux of the matter, which is the fact that the salaries in the civil service are above the market clearing level. And this is, I think it's quite unusual, because usually in many countries with oversized civil service, the people in that chamber complain that they have low salaries, but they may have also no opportunities in the private sector for other reasons, business climate and so on. But here it's a very different situation because of the level. But at the same time, that opens up an opportunity of going for erosion of those salaries with inflation and just going down that route, which would, even as a single factor, would probably improve the situation, because the weight unemployment related to the fact that there is no even attempt to find jobs because public sector is is such a cozy place to work may disappear. So I wanted to ask you, have there been attempts in any of the Arab or other Middle MENA governments to go that way? Because it seems to me, if I was a policymaker, I looked at those numbers, I would go down this route. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for these wonderful questions. Ian, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And people, for instance, thought that if they introduced private higher education, they would be more oriented towards skills rather than credentials, and that people would use those to acquire skills. But in fact, because of this incentive structure, people interviewed who go to private universities says, I just want the degree at the lowest possible cost. And it's the piece of paper that they're still driving even private higher education institutions. So it's really has little to do with who's providing the education, but the incentives in the labor market. And Oriana, yes, I think there is an over-optimism, but there is also the fact that even if you keep eroding that probability of getting that public sector job, it depends on what the fallback is. So for young women, the gap in employment conditions between the public and private sector is so large that the reservation working conditions are above the private sector and below the public sector. So there's almost no cost to remaining the unemployment queue. So because if they stop being unemployed, they're out of the labor force rather than in the private sector. And you're right. Why do women acquire so much education? Partly it is, you're right, it's a way of engaging in the public sphere and in an acceptable way, but also partly it's because the opportunity cost is low, right? I mean, if you don't have to worry about the income foregone, you can stay in education longer and the cost is much lower. And so you have now a situation where the gender gap in education has almost reversed in all of these countries in favor of women, but they still don't enter the labor market at very high rates. Now, I would argue that this education still has high social returns. In the form of healthier children, families, smaller families, better community participation, etc. So there are still fairly high returns, but they're not returns in the labor market. And I think that's so I would not, advocate for a reduction in investments in education as a result of this kind of. Now, Michael, I think you're right. Well, MENA is different in a couple of ways. One, in terms of simply the size of the public sector employment is higher in MENA than in many other contexts, except if you go to much richer countries with higher demand for public services. So partly the probability of getting those public sector jobs drives up is high, but the salaries. So it is why do politicians not erode public sector salaries? In fact, you find that in times of crisis, when salaries are being eroded for everybody because of high inflation, the most protected group is the public sector. And they're the ones who get salary adjustments in line with inflation, much more so than the private sector. Because remember, it's those politically significant groups that are getting public sector jobs. And their voice is loud and the government listens to them. So it's partly a political economy argument of why policymakers simply don't just erode the weight in the public sector. Those people are very, very loud in terms of the political economy of these countries. And so to some extent, because it's a rent seeking, it's a rent sharing process, the government tries to keep them happy by maintaining relatively high salaries, but also packages. I mean, it's the package as a whole rather than just the salary that is so attractive for people in the public sector.
Thanks, Ragui. We can take 3 more questions from this side of the audience. So one question there, and then let's see.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. 2 comments and a question. The first comment is maybe I'll follow up also what Oriana was saying, that what my impression was in Algeria in particular, we did a study some years ago that it's not only the credential, it's also the wage level at which you enter the public sector depends very much on the level of whether you're a bachelor, master, or PhD. If it doesn't depend at all on your discipline, so if you have psychology or literature, so it doesn't really change, and that makes you also unemployable if you want in the private sector, where things like mathematics also would we count more. On your the second comment on the implicit bargain, and when we confronted the labor minister in Algeria on this, he said, yeah, we know these problems. So they're actually very explicit about this. Question is, the one country that doesn't fit the mechanism that fits the description of the labor market problem, that doesn't fit the mechanism, is Lebanon, because the rent in Lebanon does not come from oil, but from remittances. So the question to you is, do you expect now that in Lebanon they found oil, that the quality of education of Lebanese graduates actually would decline over time?
Okay, yeah, first question.
More questions? Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Ragui, for a very interesting presentation. So I had 2 questions for you. Just, if you can share your views. So what you described as this authoritarian bargain, it's reality, right? It's an old contract, as you said, it's switched, I think you said 1980, but it's still like very persistent. So it's something that is very hard to correct because, as you pointed, it is a political economy issue. So the people that should change the status quo have an interest, there's a conflict of interest to maintain it. So, but because this is, again, kind of belong to a certain type of status quo, certain type of firms, I was wondering, how do you see the possibility? It's different. It's impossible to, at this point, I guess, to slice the pie, right? We know that there are the incumbents, they are protected. Like how you can then enlarge the pie. And the way we've been thinking about it is, what if you think about certain sectors, especially in the digital, where there is not such contract already set, such large presence of incumbents and traditional companies. So perhaps those areas can be conquered without having, all these limitations in place. So just sharing your views about how these new ways of doing business, which are not necessarily physically present with traditional companies, might help, again, enlarge the pie rather than slicing it. Which, again, as I said, I think at this point we lost hope in doing that. But the other one is, the second question, very quickly, is this tension between credential and skills, or the skill mismatch. Like, how relevant is that? Because, so it is really a matter of credentials, or the fact that they're actually not jobs. So the education, I understand the low quality, but it's also geared like toward public sector jobs. So how relevant is that? Do we have evidence that for a more dynamic private sector, the way the workforce it's trained in school, like there is a gap basically? So that's just a question that I had in mind. Would appreciate your feedback. Thank you.
I think it's a question at the back. Yeah.
Also, thank you very much, Ragui. I think it's always interesting to listen to you talk. I have two questions. So the first one is about this MENA paradox, right? Like you rightly put it, it's really hard to explain this kind of relationship. But I was just thinking, and I'm sure you captured that in your measurement of unemployment rate, this whole thing about willingness to work and the desire to work. Don't you think that also plays a role in kind of explaining this relationship? And beyond that, I'm also thinking about the role of this whole thing about the culture of work, right? So what is your thoughts about kind of the willingness to work, the desire to work, and this whole thing about the culture to work in explaining this MENA paradox? And my second question is about the female labor force participation. I think it would be good if you give us a sense of the kind of activities that women find themselves doing. So kind of aspects of their time poverty. What do they spend their time doing? Is it really just about shopping? Is it home kind of activities and the likes? Thank you.
Right. Okay. Well, I think your comments about Algeria are right on. In fact, Algeria is an unreconstructed authoritarian bargain. The oil flows, the oil wealth and the gas money is still coming in, and therefore the bargain is very, very healthy in Algeria. And you could see that public sector employment has hardly gone down in the case of Algeria, and it's very much based on what degree you have, what kind of job you get, and it's you can see that very clearly in the data. I've been fortunate enough to be able to do some research on Algeria because despite the very absence of data, by basically partnering with Algerian researchers who get inside access to the data, and it's just completely. Now, Lebanon is an interesting case because Lebanon is not an authoritarian bargain, but it's a confessional balance between different confessional groups that have a very fragile equilibrium, which maintains these various sectarian groups in power with different responsibilities over the economy. Now, and clearly Lebanon education has been a very important investment for the population as a way of getting out of Lebanon. It's basically a huge exporter of high quality human capital to the rest of the world, whether it's West Africa or Latin America in the old times, now into the Gulf. Now, if that market for Lebanese human capital abroad dries up, then I do think educational investments in Lebanon will go down. But so long as there are these networks that kind of drive the demand for Lebanese human capital abroad, that's what brings the remittances in, and there is kind of an equilibrium that is established right there. But again, very difficult countries to do research on because of that very fragile balance across different confessional and sectarian groups. They don't like surveys. They don't release surveys, and it's politically very difficult to get data on Lebanon. So to make that. Now, Federica, I do agree that there are potential opportunities and niches to enlarge the pie and have kind of greater dynamism in the private sector economy, and the digital economy is potentially that. So, for instance, the startup culture in the case of Egypt and the UAE is really strong, and a lot of new companies in that digital space are emerging and are quite active now. The problem, though, is what happens as they become successful and try to grow. And this is the question I kind of asked you earlier, is what's the record on companies starting small and then being able to get big and get very successful? And that's where we have a lot of barriers, that a lot of companies, for instance, like these, who make it into the digital economy and they get investments, move from Egypt and go to the UAE. They just leave the country because they're not able to make that transition to a bigger now. So that is a barrier that needs to be worked on. Is the ability of small companies to get to become bigger, and we know that that's where employment creation is concentrated in a lot of advanced countries. It's the new firms that start small and get bigger, and that opportunity is prevented from these barriers. So I think that these opportunities exist, but you have to create the space. Now, of course, the cronies are also getting into that space. And so I was talking to you earlier about the digital payment space, for example, which is growing immensely. So in Egypt, it's a military connected company that is really gone into the space and dominated it, and is doing a lot of the digital payments, and it's basically cronies connected to the military. So there is also potentially those spaces could be grabbed by the relevant elites if they're allowed to. Now, on the MENA paradox and what women are doing and what is it the culture of work? So you're right. There is a culture, basically the social norm, a very dominant social norm that says women don't need to work, and if they do work, they don't need to spend that money on the family. That's a responsibility of the male breadwinner, and so. If the job is considered devalued, the social norms saying that this is not a decent job, then the women will often stay away from it and but of course there are all kinds of exceptions to this. Need is such that those social norms don't work that way. So a lot of women have to work in order to support their families, whether they're female-headed households, broken households, disabled husband, etc. And this is where you see the culture of shame come in, because a lot of these women work in, for instance, let's say domestic help. They don't even want to tell their neighbors that they are working as a domestic worker, let alone an enumerator. So we are understating female labor force participation in these low-end positions that are considered shameful and therefore are ostracized. But I do think that despite the high burden of unpaid care work, you do have lower fertility, and you do have an ability to buy things from the market rather than make them. You have better infrastructure services, etc. So there is time that women is available for women to dedicate to market work, and they're blocked by these barriers to entry, partly because of that occupational segregation issue that we talked about earlier. A lot of women are concentrated in very few jobs. So Oriana's measure of variety, the variety of employment, if you do it by gender, you'll see that women have very, very few jobs that they're able to enter. Those jobs, then wages in them become depressed as a result of an oversupply of people entering them, and that contributes to a large gender wage gap in favor of males. So unless you deal with this, what jobs are socially, again, the point that that I think was Raymond Robertson who was saying, what jobs seem to be acceptable for women and broaden that, then you're really not going to get deal with the gender barriers to entry.
Thank you. I think we might have to have one quick question. I'm not sure if there's any burning question out there. If not, is there? No. I think then in that case, thank you so much for a wonderful keynote. And we move on to the closing remarks, and I'm going to ask Haroon to take over now. Thanks.
All right, we're just organizing the speaking order. We're not going to keep you long. I just want to, as I was sitting over the 2 days, I realized that having not done this for 2 years, probably, the thing I ended up doing at every conference, and I thought to myself, why do I find this different, right? Is that And so, as usual, I made up a rule that I think works in the conferences that I've attended, which is like a 3x3 rule. I always come back and I said, who are the 3 interesting colleagues I met, or met again, or re-engaged with, right? And I'm not going to name them. I'm just right. So you think about this. I don't get into that sort of trouble. But then the second one was, what are the 3 results? Just 3 results from papers that you didn't expect or you found really cool and interesting. And I'll just give one. Kunal today said, why do we always talk about manufacturing? Let me tell you about construction. And he spoke about how construction's share of GDP in emerging markets is actually just as high as manufacturing. So that's a really cool result that starts a paper and off you went. Then the final part of the 3x3 rule is that you usually come away, if you think about it, with 3 new and innovative ideas. And I'm looking at Oriana, because we spoke about job variety and she's given me some ideas. And perhaps that's the difference, right? To doing it via Zoom when you're sitting in your pajamas and you're dealing with kids and all sorts of things. So I just want to thank you for your attendance, for coming all the way to Cape Town. It's a harsh city, I know, to come to. But in particular from me, and then I'm going to hand over to the rest, and I know Gary will formally do it. You know how difficult it is to organize a conference, but having not done it sort of for 2 years, the team we put together have just been exceptional. And I really do want to name them. Wadia, Kezia, Mira, Sarah, who is not here. So Sarah did a lot of the organizing, but then had a holiday pre-planned and we said, no, you go. And she's been WhatsApping and finding out what's going on. Janine, who has barely joined us and is wondering what has hit her. And then finally, Colleen, who we sort of roped in at the last minute. And I just want you to please thank all of them from the bottom of our hearts, because they really have been exceptional. So let me hand over. I'm going to hand over to whoever's next.
So I'm just coming in because formal thanks are going to be provided by Gary and Ian, and Peter is going to say something. I just want to say that, when I think about, and I think I'm old enough to say this, that 10, 15 years back, when I thought of labor economics for developing countries, and when I started working on labor market, this is much more than 10 years back now, I would say, I was thinking that, how little we used to think about labor markets in developing countries being different from what we see in the West, how we've been taught labor economics in our graduate schools. It's just amazing how much the work we've been seeing in this conference so much taken us so far forward in that sense. We are no longer in the old model of labor markets as standard labor supply being upward sloping, with demand being downward sloping, no segmentation markets, all that's gone, right? And I think this conference, I hope this over the 6 years, all these years of the conference has helped in that. I do think it has helped in that. And since we've been coming for these conferences, I do think it's helped in creating this body of work by many of us who are working now with better data sets, microdata, and so on, experimental data. I think it's been remarkable what has happened in labor economics development in the last 10, 15 years. And I do hope that this conference has played a part in that. Which explains my next point, that we could have this conference again next year. Now in the Northern Hemisphere, we try to shift between Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere, and look forward to many of you being there again. And we need to keep this going, right? So let's just make sure that we keep on getting together every year and creating this body of work much more. Right, thanks.
So from the World Bank side, just to say that we're extremely pleased to see so many people here and to have such a refreshing conference, loads and loads of great ideas. We agreed between the organizers on a division of labor about who would say what, and this is one of the themes of the conference is divisions of labor. So I have one task, which is to say that, well, the conference historically has been financed by the partners, but this year we also got money from GIZ to pay for the travel costs of scholars from developing countries, for which we're extremely grateful. Sabine is here representing GIZ, and I think that it makes a huge difference to the quality of the conference that we've been able to do that. So thank you very much to the GIZ people.
Right, so I met Haroon first in like October 2014 when the network was started, and then I learned very early that at DPRU, working on compliance is very important. So first of all, I would also thank all the DPRU team, and they were enforcing that we were, going to rooms and ensuring compliance with that. I also want to thank all of you. I asked yesterday morning, I kind of encourage you to enjoy the breaks, to talk to people, to exchange, and all of you complied with that. So that's fantastic. What I really appreciate is that people keep returning to the conference. We get 330 papers this year. There are like 60 speakers here. So the cut is really tight. And then I also appreciate that we have this kind of community. When the network had the first conference with the World Bank, a little bit smaller group back then in 2016, Ragui, you were speaking at that conference just in the regular sessions. Now we're back with the Keynote. We're really thankful for that. So keep submitting papers, keep telling your colleagues that this is an event that we would love to have you next year. Thanks so much.
So I have a list of names of people to thank, and I'd like to begin by thanking Haroon. Haroon, you have done a fantastic job in not only what you do, but in bringing together a staff that has made this thing go so smoothly on the other side of the world from where most of us live. And so it's been terrific working with you, and on behalf of everybody, I just want to say thank you for that. And then we proceed to the last step.
Yeah. So I'm trying to get the administrators to come out of the shadows. Please, Gary Goldman and come down.
What is Wadia here? And Kezia? Mira? Janine? And Sarah is not here, but let's give her a round of applause anyway. Oh, Colleen. So once again, thank you to everybody, those of you who organized this, those of you who came and participated and presented and discussed. I think it's been a great conference. I look forward to the next one. See you all there then.